Okay, good morning. Today we begin a discussion on convection, natural convection heat transfer. So we will see different configurations, what are the governing equations, and how does it differ from forced convection. In the end, I'll be giving the correlations, set of correlations. So those are a summary of the correlation that you would require in solving problems. Okay, that I will post up on the forum. Now to begin with, let's see what is natural convection. And quite often we use the word also free convection. Okay, so there's a small difference between these two. When we say natural convection, this means that you have the flow is influenced by any body force which is caused by the temperature field. What it means is that as heat transfer takes place in the fluid, it sets up a temperature gradient in the fluid. This in turn generates a body force, and this body force influences the way the fluid will move. Now this is what was not happening in forced convection, where we said that the external driving force is so much that temperature gradients do not affect the bulk flow that was taking place. That's the difference between natural convection and forced convection. So how can we get body forces? One is what we have seen is buoyancy, and this is caused by you have a force field which is gravity. If gravity were not there, there would be no buoyancy force and natural convection will not happen. And that is the situation in say things like the International Space Station or something in orbit. The other way that body forces can be generated is, for example, a fluid which is in solid body rotation. So what we are doing here is, the idea is, say, for example, if you have a cylinder which has got some say liquid in it, and this we are rotating, and at the same time, say, the walls of this cylinder are say heated, then what you have inside is a centrifugal force field, where you can say that the fluid is in solid body rotation and you have this velocity gradient. So you have omega square r there, and on top of that, when you enforce a temperature gradient, we will start generating elements here and here which have different density, different mass, and because of that they will experience different forces. These forces will begin to start influencing the flow, and the mean flow, which was nice and beautiful like that, will get distorted. So an example of this is electric machines, motors and generators, where there is always a gap between the rotor and the stator. And in the small gap, there is air, or in large generators in power stations, this gap is filled with hydrogen. And since this is rotating, this is stationary in a very small gap, you end up having a very different type of a force field than what we would expect, that if you just blow air straight through this, it will be like force flow through an annulus, but that's not actually going to happen. So this is a general, all these cases, irrespective of how the body force came about, is classified as natural convection. Free convection is a special case of natural convection, where we have a surface or a body which is surrounded by an infinite fluid. And this is a stationary. So a hot plate or something standing in a room where the room air is still, the walls are very far away, that comprises again natural convection. But this particular special case where you have only air and no other surfaces coming into play, this is classified as free convection. So what we will start off by looking at is free convection, because that will help us to generate the equations and the various terms that come in, their physical significance. And from there, we will then go on to getting how the flow behaves and what are the type of solutions that we can get. Okay, so we have, as before, two basic configurations which I had introduced right in the beginning. And that is, and these are both, this particular one where you have a plate which could be either hotter than the surrounding fluid or colder than the surrounding fluid. This is in an ambient fluid and where the walls are very far away, and it cools by natural convection. An essential feature here is that gravity is an important player. So G you must show there. The plate could either be isothermal, heated or cooled, or isoheat flux, or any other combination. In general, when we look at this problem, the fluid velocity at far away from the plate is 0, the fluid is stationary. So we say U infinity is 0, and then T infinity could be there depending upon whether it is heating or cooling. Relative to the plate temperature, this temperature could be something here. But far away from this plate, the temperature is T infinity. The other case we will look at is internal flow, and now there are two plates. In between this there is the fluid. One of the plates is at T1, the other plate is facing the fluid at T2. On the back side they may be insulated, and this sets up different types of currents, and here the fluid is encountering surfaces on both sides. This is different from the case that we looked at here. So this particular problem, we don't call it free convection, but this we will call as natural convection, and this one free convection. Another configuration of internal flow is you have two infinitely long cylinders parallel to one another. In between them there is a gap. So if this gap is there, one plate is hot, one surface is hot, one is cold, you will have heat transfer that is governed inside this by natural convection, where gravity in both these cases, this is an important player. So we will look at this case first. It is easier to get different aspects of it. We will write the differential equations and then we will see what happens. Okay, before that, I'll show you a small video. Okay, what you are going to see here is a person who is sitting, and the flow around this person has been made visible by the technique of called Schlieren, where you have one set of beams going over the person, another bypassing it, and then the two are merged together, and this produces, it tells us that wherever there is a temperature gradient, the light would have got deflected and we would see light and dark zones coming up there. So if you take a photograph, this is what it will look like, and it tells us that the air is cooler than the body. And here you can see all these colors here, there is some other color here, that these are the different temperature gradients over here. So let's play the video and see what it tells us. So this is what is happening to all of us who are sitting in an environment silently, quietly, and the air is cooler than our body. And you can see air currents rising from the body. And in this case you see something else, that as you inhale and exhale, you can see this little jet coming here. And that is not that you are smoking, but this is just that the air coming out of the nose is slightly warmer than the ambient air, and the density gradients are showing us that quite nicely. So this thing shows us that if we are sitting still, what type of airflow takes place around us. And on a bright day, if you are out in the sun and if you look at your shadow, you will see similar things happening, that something rising from the shadow at the top of your head. So this tells us that here it is, air is coming from here, it is going over this and going that side. And I'll play it once again. And you can see what distance from the body is the fluid being affected by the temperature gradient. And it tells us that it's not very large. And say on the back it is about this much. So it is of the order of magnitude of the dimensions of the body itself here. So how do we predict this? And this is what we would like to do. We ultimately say, how can I design clothing or protective clothing to minimize or maximize heat transfer? So that's the technique of Schlieren, which can make the temperature gradient visible. And because the air is still all around, the only thing that is happening here is that the flow that we see is due to temperature gradient, and this picture is showing the temperature gradients. Come back and say, well, what actually happens on the plate, and get some physical insights into it before we start looking at the equations. Is that if we take an element, say here, then if the wall is hotter than the fluid, this element which is in contact with the wall will go to the wall temperature. The fluid element next to that will be at a slightly lower temperature, and as you go away, finally the element here will be at the ambient fluid temperature. So now what has happened is, because these are different temperatures, if the situation is such that because of the temperature there is a density gradient, because of that there is expansion of this fluid, its density goes down compared to the ambient fluid or the pressure gradient applied on it, it starts experiencing a buoyancy and it will start moving up. That is the fundamental phenomena of natural convection, that it is the temperature difference within the fluid which causes the fluid to flow. So in some sense, this is an extreme case that there is no forced flow on the plate, because when we were looking at forced flow on the plate, we did have temperature gradients in those fluid elements also, but we said that this particular phenomena that happened in forced convection is very weak compared to buoyancy, and so we neglected buoyancy in all the discussion of forced convection. So that was an extreme case where the temperature induced body forces were negligible. If this is a case where forced convection induced, say, inertia or viscous force, inertia forces, those are negligible. So we have two extremes, one forced, one natural convection, and we'll see later on that it could be a possibility that the forced airflow on this is very light and this velocity is produced something, and the two are comparable to one another. So in that case, we cannot say that this is a problem of forced convection heat transfer, neither is it a problem of natural convection heat transfer. So these are problems of what we will call as mixed convection. They are far too complex, so we will not go into detail in this course on those. We'll just give you some correlations for that. But our discussion will now be entirely on this case where the fluid is stationary and the fluid has got forced on it some temperature gradients. And like forced convection, we will also like to ask what happens to the temperature field and what happens to the velocity field. Okay, so before we write the equations, let's go back and try to understand how the boundary layers form on this. As we had said earlier, that is where a lot of the action takes place, and understanding the boundary layers tells us how to form the equations and what to expect. So we do the same thing now. We have a plate and we have the fluid here which is stationary, far away. And let's take the case where the wall is isothermal at a temperature Tw. So isothermal wall, we will denote it by a T inside a circle. And we ask the question, what is it that I want to know? I want to know what is the rate at which heat transfer takes place from the plate. This is a typical question that one would pose. So what do we do here? Let's see what happens. The fluid in contact with the surface, it will be hot. As you go further away from here, the temperature will continue to decrease. Finally, it becomes T infinity. So which means that if I plot the temperature in this direction at this location, initially I have a high temperature which is TW, and far away we have this temperature which is T infinity. Here it is TW which is higher. So I'm plotting temperature on the y-axis and this axis, and this is what we have called the normal to the plate. What we've done in force convection was y direction. Along the direction of the plate, this is x direction. So what will happen in between here is that gradually this fluid temperature will keep coming down, and finally at some point it will be the same. And if we do that at this another location, say over here closer to the bottom edge, here what we will see is, now okay, what did this temperature gradient do? It starts this fluid element here, this is here, and this is there. The first thing that will happen is, where there is a temperature gradient, it will induce a velocity. So what it also tells us now that this element which is in contact with the wall, this will have zero velocity. And we know that far away, this element also has zero velocity. But in between, the fluid is moving. So the only way this can be satisfied is that you end up getting a boundary layer where the velocity profile is like that, and finally it becomes zero outside. So there is a point in that boundary layer here where the velocity is maximum. The temperature profile, which has a steady decrease of temperature from surface outwards, has a surface plate temperature of PW. The thing is, this velocity you do not know, because this was caused by the temperature difference that came on it. So if you make a plot here also, we'll see a similar thing, except that now this distance, which we will call, say, delta H, the hydrodynamic boundary layer thickness, or delta T, the thermal boundary layer thickness, they are pretty much the same. If you come further down closer to this, maybe the temperature difference here did not go very further, because the flow was now, as we see that there is a flow going to take place upwards in this direction, and so the temperature profile here is going to be, the velocity profile will be something like this, and the temperature profile here, the TW, will be the same thing what we had earlier, but now the temperature will drop much more sharply and then will become constant. So this is what is happening, that away from the plate, the temperature keeps decreasing. Inside this thermal boundary layer, there is a peak velocity, which is proportional in some sense to the temperature gradients that are formed inside the boundary, in the thermal boundary layer itself. So two things now develop, that the limit, the point up to which this temperature gradient is felt, we can join those points, and that becomes a thermal boundary layer. And by and large, this will also be the only region which experiences a body force, and so this will be the region where you will also have the flow. So this is in some sense the limit of the hydrodynamic boundary layer also. So just drawing another line, and we say this is the hydrodynamic boundary layer. Maybe because of viscous drag, some fluid outside also may be getting pushed up. So this is what the boundary layers are building up in a vertical flat plate. Let's see how the velocity will take place. If we take a control volume like this here, then along the boundary layer, and say up here, then we know that from the top surface there is fluid going out. The continuity requires that there has to be fluid coming in. So where is the fluid going to come in? And what will happen here is that all of the fluid cannot just come in from this side and as a jet and then blow. This is not going to happen. So some of the fluid which was here, this would come in and this would rise. Then there will be a very small velocity here and then this would rise. Then this would happen. Then some fluid will come from here and this would take place. Outside this, the velocity is 0. So here it will come and go like this. Here it will come and go like this. So that is how this plate is driving this fluid to go upwards. And that's the type of velocity that will be induced in this. Outside the boundary layer, velocities go to 0. So that is the difference. And here also we have to say that the velocity here is also 0. What these arguments have told us, that the boundary layer begins to grow from this point. In this case, that will be the equivalent of the leading edge of the plate. It keeps getting thicker as we go up. That means the distance between the cold fluid and the hot plate has become much more, and in some sense that means that the temperature gradients have become less, so the local heat flux will keep decreasing as you go. And that also, so that means that because q dot double prime as you go x, when x increases, this locally decreases, which also means that we can expect that the local heat transfer coefficient will decrease in the direction from here to up. So this is qualitatively very similar to what we saw in forced convection. Okay, so this is what is going to happen. We'll plot one more thing here on this and say, well, how will the isotherms of the fluid look like? That means, which are the lines of constant temperature. So what happens is, outside this boundary layer, everything is T infinity. So there's nothing going to be there. You will have isotherms only inside this boundary layer. So that was also the case of forced convection. But if we say this is TW, then say which are the points which are TW plus 1 degree Celsius. And then you will see that it will start from here and that will be a line which keeps going like that. Then we say which is the line which is TW plus 2 degrees Celsius, say half a degree Celsius. And that will be a line that will go off like that. And the next lower line will go like that. And finally, the edge of the thermal boundary layer, it will be the isotherm line of T infinity. Outside that, it is all T infinity. The plate itself is the isotherm of TW. So we will see isotherms of this type. And this is going to be the case of a constant wall temperature case. And in case there was a flow coming onto it, as we saw in forced convection, there also the isotherms will look like this. The difficulty was that in forced convection it's very, very difficult to visualize that type of isotherms. But we have good pictures that can tell us whether this actually happens or not. So let's look at some pictures now. Okay, so there are two pictures I'm showing here. On the left side is a plate that has been heated and is maintained at a constant temperature. On the right, we do not see it very clearly, but it is a very thin foil which is electrically heated, which means that this is producing the boundary condition of a constant wall heat flux. So here what are we seeing in both cases is a technique called interferometry. That's what you might have come across in physics, that if you have two beams going in and one is deflected, then at the point where the two beams join, there will be constructive and destructive interference. So you will see dark and bright lines. So that's what has been done here. The equipment that is used is called a Mach-Zehnder interferometer, and you have put a laser light in it, and another part of the light without going through the domain comes out, it joins up with them, and it produces these fringe patterns. So what you are seeing are interference fringes. And what you see here is that the plate is got one particular, is all black. Far away, this is the fluid which is all white. So here it is at constant temperature, and then we begin to see one band of dark thing followed by another band of bright, then a dark line, then a white one, then dark, white, like that all the way to the plate. And if you are very close to the plate, you will see that next to the plate there is a continuous bright line. So what each line represents is one particular unique temperature. And in fact, you can actually go back, measure the distances physically, and from the image you can get the distances between the fringes, and you can correlate that fringe spacing to density gradients, which in turn can be correlated to temperature differences. So you get a complete map of the temperature field that I was just qualitatively drawing there from an experiment like this, where we did not use anything else but interferometry, and it gave us huge amount of information about the temperature field in this. So this was the bright fringe, and then there's a parallel is a dark fringe, then like that. So this fringe pattern is exactly similar to what I have just drawn, and this is the bottom edge of the plate, where you can see that these are joining and going up. So it tells us not just qualitatively but in some sense quantitatively also what is the thickness of the boundary layer and how does it change in the vertical direction. It is getting slightly thicker. You can see that. That means that the local heat transfer coefficient is decreasing in this direction. So this confirms what I have just done for an isothermal plate. The picture on the right is for a constant heat flux case where we did electric heating. And what is not very clear in this, but if you can blow it up, let's see if you can see that. Okay, so this is what it is. And what one can see is that some of these bright lines are originating. You can see this bright line, it comes here and it ends here. So that means that temperature contour is beginning on the surface and going on. So if you are at the lower edge, you can see that the number of these fringes is much smaller. So you can see here this is the plate in the middle, and you can count these, and these are fewer in number, but as we went up, their number increased, which meant that you have higher and higher temperatures coming up at the top of the plate, and that is what you would expect in a constant heat flux case, that the isotherms would have a slightly different shape and size and location than what we saw in isothermal case. Okay, so here is what happened in that picture. This is the plate, and what we saw as isotherms there was that there is one isotherm which was going off like that, another isotherm which was going off like that, another isotherm coming off there, another coming out there, and this could be say bright fringes and dark lines like that. So that is what we were seeing, and that happened because this is that Q dot double prime at the wall is constant, and since local heat transfer is decreasing with X, the local wall temperature must keep increasing, and that is what is happening here. So you have higher temperatures coming up, and so a higher temperature isotherm generating gradually from the outer surface. So that was the iso heat flux case picture. Again, that was an interferogram, and we can see that it's a technique which is relatively complex but shows us a lot of very interesting features which would otherwise not be able to see and confirm to ourselves that this is what actually happens. So what I've discussed here so far has been for the case where TW is greater than T infinity, a heated plate standing in a quiescent fluid. The entire discussion is equally true if we apply it to the case where the wall temperature is less than the surrounding fluid. And I'll just draw one case that if this is a plate where wall temperature is less than T infinity, then we know that exactly the opposite will happen. A fluid element here which is close to the wall will become colder, its density will decrease, it will begin to fall down. And so you'll have a boundary layer building up on this, which happens like that, and all the flow that you would see is happening a small velocity there, and then this is going down, a small velocity there, and this goes down, small velocity there, it goes down, and you have cold fluid falling down. You can visualize this if you look at an experiment where you take something and dip it in liquid nitrogen, or you have liquid nitrogen there and the nitrogen vapor is coming out, and you can see that the fluid is so cold that after it boils out of the vessel, it comes down along the side of the vessel and spreads along the floor. And that's the reason for that. But all the theory that we developed for the heated wall case is absolutely equally valid for the cooled wall case. So whatever correlations we see, whatever argument we are going to put out for this case, this is what we will discuss, are absolutely equally valid for this case. This is the difference that is there. Okay, so now having looked at how the boundary layers develop, the hydrodynamic boundary layer and the thermal boundary layer they develop, we say, well, let's write the equations for the boundary. And we only do the differential form of these equations, where the surface is heated, and we are going to consider element over there. And as we have seen, there is a thermal boundary layer that builds up like that, and very close to that is also the hydrodynamic boundary layer. And the reason is that fluid velocity is sustained by temperature difference. If there is no temperature difference, the fluid will not be in motion. So outside this, there is no motion. Close to that, only because of some inertial and drag forces, that this fluid, which was higher temperature, actually pulled out this fluid because of viscous force. But that's small. So we take this element and say, what are the conservation equations for this element? Our coordinate system is that normal to the plate, this is y. From this thing, upward direction, we have x, and the whole thing is being influenced by gravity. So this is the reason for this. I will leave it to you to think that what will happen inside the International Space Station. G is almost zero. It's a microgravity environment. And if you have a hot plate or something that is hot, how will it cool? And this is an important thing, because if you see pictures of that, they have a lot of electronics there, they do a lot of experiments, and especially if you have electronics there, like you have seen on here, whether it's your UPS or things like that, it will have a heat sink. That heat sink is sitting in still air, so natural convection is cooling it. But so then, because of gravity, we have a natural convection current. In the space station, there is no gravity. How will it cool? Will it be better off? Will it be worse off? What do we need to do? So you can think about that. So for this element, the equations are exactly the same in differential form as what we had developed for the forced convection case, or rather at the beginning, when I said boundary layer equations, it did not differentiate really whether it was forced convection, free convection, or any other convection. So you have du dx plus dv dy equal to 0, which is the conservation of mass. We are assuming that normal to the plane, which is the z direction, there is no change taking place. Our energy equation is exactly the same. U dt dx plus v dt dy is equal to alpha del square T by del y square. The dominant temperature gradient is in this case. So these are the convection terms. This is your diffusion term. The difference comes in the x momentum equation. So the left part here, u du dx plus v du dy is same. Then comes the pressure term, minus 1 by rho dp by dx. Then the viscous forces, and we have to now put here Fx triple prime, which is the body force. This fluid element is experiencing a body force that we cannot neglect, which exists in a pressure field created by G, where we know that P is equal to rho Gx. And that is the reason we end up seeing a buoyancy force. So this is the equation that has come up, and this is fairly general equation, that is not just what we are looking here. This is actually a case of free convection, but this equation is equally true in general for all types of natural convection. We did not make any assumption at this point of that at all. If it was that rotating thing, the body force would come about because of the solid body rotation induced by the rotation of the fluid. So that is the change, and this is where we have an important difference coming up, that you have to now include the pressure term and the body force term, and now see what happens. So we now relook at the body force term and we say, well, what happens? Well, we have just seen there is a pressure gradient being set up, where we know that P is equal to, in this case, X was going in the up direction. So this is rho Gx. And if we differentiate it and say that the only dominant pressure gradient in this domain, in this problem, is in the X direction, that dP dy, dP dz are very small, then we say approximate that partial derivative of P with X can be written as dP dx. And this, from this equation, is minus rho infinity into G, where rho infinity is the density far away from the fluid. So that is the enforced pressure gradient on this problem. And now we combine this with the body force term. In that equation, we had these two terms, this one and this one. So let's pick up these two terms and do a little simplification on that. So the first term was minus 1 by rho dP dx. That we got minus rho infinity G. And we say what is the body force acting on that element? Is nothing but mgh, density into this volume. So that is just rho G. And if you combine these two, this becomes G upon rho into rho infinity minus rho. The rho is the density of this fluid element. So its temperature is T, its density is rho. Where far away, the temperature is T infinity, the density is T infinity. So it's a combination of these two that produced this differential term, which we know from school days as being buoyancy. So that's what has come about. So it's actually in reality a combination of the pressure field and the body force that produced this particular combination. And so if we now substitute it back into the X momentum equation, we have the left part, which is exactly the same, nothing has changed here. This part has not changed, but we have now put this term in place of these two terms. So this equation becomes, this is equal to G upon rho, rho infinity minus rho, and this is the important thing that has come into this equation. That is making life now complicated. Rather more complicated. Even without this in force convection, we are enough of a trouble. So let's see what happens to this now. How do we get rho and rho infinity, and how can we, what is it connected to? We know from an ideal gas case that, okay, I know rho is nothing but E is equal to rho RT, so that is what we are getting there. Okay, there's a question there. Okay. Why convective heat transfer coefficient decreases with increasing H during natural convection? Okay, let's go back. So we'll answer this question. It says, why is it that when you go in this direction, the local heat transfer coefficient decreases? That is the question that has come, and we'll just answer that by the analogy from forced convection that we saw, that if the flow was coming like this, then the thermal boundary layer was building up like that, and you can argue it in two ways. One, if you look at different locations over here, the temperature gradient here is very sharp, here it is less, and here it is even less. So dt dy at the wall keeps getting less, and q dot double prime at the wall is minus k times this term. So this will keep decreasing, and we define h, local h, as q dot double prime upon some temperature difference, Tw minus T infinity, and T infinity and Tw, they are constant, Hx will keep decreasing. So that is one line of argument. A qualitative way of looking at the thing is that here you have fluid which is at close to the plate at the wall temperature Tw. Far away here you have fluid at this temperature. This energy has to go from here to here. So it has to overcome this boundary layer barrier over here. Here the barrier is smaller, here it is bigger, here it is bigger. So in some sense you have got more and more resistance coming in for energy flow from here to this plate, and that also can tell you that Hx has to go down. And when you look at natural convection, which is what we are now looking at, we do not have an external flow being enforced on it, but we said that this is how the boundary layers develop, both the thermal and the hydrodynamic boundary layers, the same thing is happening as what we saw here. The boundary layer keeps getting thicker and thicker, and that's why as you go up, Hx keeps decreasing. Okay, so that is, and if you look at the temperature profile, then also you will see the same thing happening here. So that's the reason why as we go up, the local heat transfer coefficients will keep decreasing. Okay, so that was the question. Now we'll go back and see this equation and say that what is it that this rho depends on. And we have two possibilities here. One is an ideal gas, or in general, whatever what the fluid is. If you recall your dynamics, we defined a lot of properties there, and one of the properties that came up was this one, that beta is equal to minus 1 upon rho dP by dt at constant pressure, and this is defined as the coefficient of volume expansion. So that volume expansion, you can relate it with density, and you can figure out what is the dependence of rho on T and T. So we look at now two cases. One, an ideal gas. So that we have equation of state there, P equal to rho RT, and you can differentiate it and see what is the equation. That is one thing we can. But if it is a liquid where we don't have exact state equation of state like this, then we have no option but to go to property table and use correlations from there to get this volume expansion coefficient. What we will do now is we will look at in general and say approximate it as by the ideal gas type of equation dependence. And so what we do is T minus rho is almost like beta times rho into T infinity minus T, which came from this equation. Okay, so this is what we have now ended up getting. And when we substitute it in the x momentum equation, the left side equations are the same, this equation is the same, and here we get minus rho beta T infinity minus T, or alternatively you can make this a plus sign and say rho beta T minus T infinity. Both, that's the same thing. Okay, so what has happened now? This is our working equation which we need to solve, and this is your x momentum equation finally. So we have the conservation of mass and energy equations which were like before, but this is the conservation of momentum equation, and this is where the whole difference between natural convection and forced convection shows up. In that we have temperature coming in explicitly in the momentum equation. We did not have this thing come explicitly. We did not have an explicit temperature dependence coming in the momentum equation in forced convection. And because of that, you have a much more complex problem to solve. Okay, now what we will do is, we will try to non-dimensionalize this and see what we learn from that. And to non-dimensionalize it, we will need some type of characteristic length, characteristic velocity, and characteristic temperature in the problem. So what we can do is, we will normalize u and v velocities on some velocity u, but we don't know what u is, because in forced convection we had u infinity, here we don't have a u. So in a minute we will come back and say, well, can I define a characteristic velocity in this problem? We will not dimensionalize x on L, which is the length of the plate, that is x star, even same with y star. Temperature can be normalized as a temperature difference T minus T infinity upon TW minus T infinity. So you have a non-dimensional temperature. And I am denoting all of these by the star. So the question is, how do I get a characteristic velocity in this problem which is induced by the temperature? So we go back and see the boundary layer profiles that we had drawn, and we'll come back to that. And we say that, well, a typical velocity profile would be that if this is the plate which is heated, normal to this, we have a velocity profile which is like this. That would be the velocity profile normal to the plate at any location. And we say, well, let's look at this point where the velocity is maximum and do an order of magnitude comparison of different terms in the momentum equation. Okay, so when we do that, you are left with, say, u du by dx on one side, and the right side we say, well, if diffusion is less and convection cross stream to the flow is also negligible, so that means we are neglecting the other two terms, then we are left with the fact that u du by dx is g beta tw minus t infinity. This is approximately, this is not sort of exact thing, but approximately. And we can then put the rho on both sides. So you have this equation, rho du dx plus rho g beta tw minus t infinity. They are of comparable magnitude. We can equate these two, and now to do a small simplification and say that from this equation u is proportional to square root, we can integrate it now, is equal to square root of g beta tw minus t infinity into x. That begins to give us on the right side, g is beta is a property of the fluid known, tw, t infinity both are known temperatures in the problem, x is a distance, you can even make it L, and that will be u at L. So we have a characteristic velocity which we have got in terms of knowns on the right side. So we created a characteristic velocity for this problem, one was not given. And we use this velocity to define a Reynolds number, which is u, x is the distance from the bottom edge, ux upon mu, which is equal to square root. If you substitute this u into this, what you get is that this is under the square root g beta tw minus infinity into x cube upon mu square. So that is telling us that all these things are something unique to the problem. So we have defined some sort of Reynolds number in natural convection, or in this case in free convection. So that's a typical order of magnitude of a number that you would expect in this type of a problem. And a characteristic velocity in the flow, we say, well, what is the maximum that you can get? It's when x becomes equal to L and u0 becomes square root g beta tw minus t infinity into L. So that tells us an idea about the characteristic velocity in the flow, and this equation here told us what is a typical non-dimensional parameter, non-dimensional Reynolds number in this flow. Behind these, we can write this that REL, which is based on this definition of Reynolds number, this is equal to u0, which we say is this velocity at x equal to L multiplied by the length parameter divided by the kinematic viscosity. So that is some sort of a number which characterizes this flow, and this is the maximum possible number because u0 is now based on L, which means that the highest velocity in this flow will be at the top of the plate where the fluid is leaving the plate. So this is the plate. It ends over there, the boundary layers are growing over there, and the velocity profile, which was like this at this point, here it became slightly bigger and it became biggest at the x equal to N. So this is the peak velocity in the flow, which is occurring at the peak distance L, and on that basis we have defined the velocity here because of the temperature difference and the length, and based on that we defined a Reynolds number for this. So now we have some non-dimensional numbers that have come to us. And the difference with forced convection was that we had to look at the flow itself and argue out what sort of a maximum velocity could be there in this problem. That's what we have done. So with this, we have now some form of non-dimensionalizing the equations. And what we do is we put all those non-dimensional things into the equation and solve it. So it becomes u star du star by dx. This will become v star du star by dy star. And on the right side, we'll get two terms coming in here. One is g beta tw minus t infinity into L upon u0 square multiplied by t star. This was the buoyancy term. REL, the Reynolds number we just defined, del square u by del y square star. Or you can further simplify it and write it as GRL upon REL square into T star plus del square U upon del Y square. And that becomes our full X momentum equation in non-dimensional form. Okay, so the left side are the same convective terms. The temperature term has come into the momentum equation, but this extra term is sitting there, GRL upon REL square plus del square U star upon del Y square star. So the question is, how did we convert this into this? Which requires us to go and say that we have now defined a new non-dimensional number that on this side, g beta tw minus t infinity into L upon u0 square was that, divided by into REL square, this is u0 L into nu whole thing square, and this becomes g beta tw minus t infinity into L cube upon nu square. This is a new non-dimensional number that we have now come up with. We call it Grashof number for the length parameter L, and that is an important number in natural convection or free convection. So G, beta is volumetric coefficient of expansion. Tw minus T infinity is a typical peak temperature difference in the problem. L, the length of the plate, nu the kinematic viscosity of the fluid. So this is the definition of Grashof number. And the reason we got this particular complicated form was this particular way in which we non-dimensionalized the equation, defined certain parameters, and then came up with this. So this is what is the Grashof number, and it is, if you see what we have done is that if we take Reynolds number at any location on this plate, this will be u at that point x upon nu. That's the definition of Reynolds number. And if we now start putting different things, the definition of u that we had earlier, tw minus t infinity, x cube upon nu square, and the whole thing is under the square root. And what is this whole thing? It is nothing but this. So this is actually GRX. So we say what is the typical number in the flow? That simplification tells us it is equal to square root of the Grashof number. So what that means is that the Grashof number plays something of the same role, the same importance that Reynolds number had in force convection. And consistent to be with all these types of flows is that the non-dimensional parameter in that equation was the Reynolds number, but now with buoyancy, it is a modified Reynolds number which includes a temperature difference term inside it. That is what we have here. Okay, so with that, we got that non-dimensional equation worked out, and we'll define a few more slightly modified terms over here now. That the product of Grashof number and Prandtl number, this appears quite frequently in many correlations, it also tells you what is the dependence of Nusselt number on number. And so we have defined a new number, which is the Rayleigh number, Rax, as the product of Grashof number into Prandtl number. Okay, so that's what we get. Actually, what doing is trying to capture the importance of Prandtl number in that equation, in the momentum equation or the energy equation, if you want to look at it, and in some sense in the solution. When a lot of people did measurements and tried to come up with this type of a relation from experimental measurements and tried to fit a data to the tried to fit a correlation to that data, they found that this product doesn't work very nice. So they defined a new number, which is the Boussinesq number, BOX, defined as Grashof number multiplied by the square of the Prandtl number. And the reason they did this is that in this case, NUX, or average Nusselt number, N over length NUL bar, these are functions of Rayleigh number and some weak dependence on Prandtl number. Some would argue that only Rayleigh number is enough because it is taking care of Prandtl number. There will be some relations like that. But they said that the best correlations you would get, that the best curve fit to the data would be that this Nusselt number would be a function of the Boussinesq number. So what do we have now? That we got the non-dimensional equations. If you were to solve it and take the data and make non-dimensional correlation things, we can express the solution of these equations in natural convection as Nusselt number, the function of Grashof number and Prandtl number, or some other combination of Prandtl number. In some case, maybe Rayleigh number into Prandtl number, and maybe Rayleigh number or Grashof number into Prandtl number square. Essentially, what it means is that all these types of correlations that we have, they have something Reynolds number, a Grashof number to the power something into Prandtl number functions, which could be much more complicated than what we had in the case of force convection. If you look at force convection, Prandtl number was raised to some point, and that was the answer. Here it will be Prandtl number upon something into Prandtl square plus something something something, and these equations will become a little bit longish and complicated. Essentially, they are nothing but a way to express the dependence of the problem solution on the Prandtl number. Okay, so that's what we have. So that's where we want to get the solutions that have a vertical plate. How do I get the local heat transfer coefficient? And this, you look up the correlation tables and say it's a flat plate, it's an isothermal plate, or iso heat flux case, whichever those cases may be, and you'll get some function which says this is related to Grashof number and some Prandtl number, which means that in that problem, with all the data that you need to calculate GRX, you need to calculate PR, use that formula, you get NUX, and from there you say H at X is equal to, from the definition, Nusselt number into K by L. K, remember, K is conductivity of the fluid. And in all this type of problem solving, when you evaluate properties of the substance, these have to be done at some sort of a mean temperature, or the film temperature that we call it, or the property temperature, and that could be a mean of TW and T infinity. That's the simplest case there. This then is how we would be solving problems. But why we use this is what I have just explained. That it captures a solution of the equations which are too complicated to solve. And in this course, we don't solve those equations. On the other hand, if we want the exact solution, then we use those equations and say, okay, I will define the domain into lots of elements. and write the equation for each and every one of these points. Subject to the given boundary conditions, I will solve this, and that is what we will do. Is after discretizing the equations, we will be discretizing the three conservation equations that we have now seen. So if you have to do a numerical solution of this problem, you have to be clear what are the conservation equations that are applicable for this problem. Using the x momentum equation from force convection into this is give completely wrong results, and that's to be avoided. And that's the importance of this discussion, that for any given problem, one must know what is the correct set of conservation equations. And to that, what are the boundary conditions to be applied? And then you can go to a software or a package or write your own code or a mix of those two and get the solution as temperature and velocity at every point in this whole domain. That is the idea of CFD, or what we may call here as computational heat transfer. That's what we will be doing. And that's the reason why we have taken time to understand how we got that equation, especially in this case, the temperature coming in an explicit form in the momentum equation. That was the big difference that has happened. Okay, so let's see now. That's what I have been saying, that Nusselt number is a function of Grashof number, Prandtl number. So these are the, if we do some simplifications, we then see that the boundary layer growth goes as 1 upon Grashof number to the power 1 by 4. So if it's delta by L, or you say delta by X, this is proportional to 1 upon GRX to the power 0.25, and that is again something similar, that where in the force convection case we saw that delta grows as a function of Reynolds number. Here you have Grashof number, but as I've just explained, this is a sort of a Reynolds number for this particular problem. So that's one thing to know. The next thing is, let's see in terms of ratio of various forces, what is it that Grashof number really represents? And earlier when we looked at force convection, we got Reynolds number. This was the ratio of inertia to viscous forces. And in the inertia force is what we learned from the first law of motion, the ability of something to keep moving in the same velocity direction unless there is nothing else happening. So if you have a lot of inertia, the ability of the viscous forces to drag it down is less, something else happens. And that's what Reynolds number was telling us. And there we had extreme cases where Reynolds number is very much less than 1. You could start with Reynolds number 0.001. And in practical application, you may go to Reynolds number 10 to the power 7, 10 to the power 10. So we have a very large range of Reynolds number that we are working with. There, here, viscous forces completely dominate the flow. Here, viscous forces are very, very weak. They are not all that important, but they do come to play there. Okay, so that was Reynolds number, inertia to viscous forces. Then we came across Prandtl number, which was mu upon alpha, which was thermal momentum diffusivity in a fluid, the rate at which the effect of, say, velocity gradients is felt, divided by thermal diffusivity, which is the rate at which energy can go through it, and effects of temperature gradients enforced on the fluid, what is the rate at which they are felt. So those two non-dimensional numbers we have come across so far. Grashof number, in a sense, represents the ratio of buoyancy forces to viscous forces. This is essentially what it is giving us. There are some who could argue that Grashof number is a product of buoyancy to viscous forces multiplied by inertia to viscous forces. But essentially, this is what Grashof number is telling us. Buoyancy came into the equation because of the temperature difference, T minus T infinity. And viscous forces came about because of mu. So that is what is telling us that how important is the viscous buoyancy force related to viscous force. Now if you look at all three, that in the problem, you would have all forces. So you have the buoyancy force, which is the field-induced buoyancy force, the viscous force, and inertia force. And what we did in the force convection part was that we considered only these two because we got Reynolds number in the problem, and we didn't even talk about buoyancy force, but with the assumption I had mentioned that in that case, the temperature gradient induced body force is so small that we neglected it. So we had only a Reynolds number dependence in the problem. Now that we are looking at natural convection, we are looking at predominantly these two. And so inertia is not that big a player. But can we express all these three together and say, look, if I am presented a problem, can I say that I should tackle it as a force convection problem, or as a natural convection problem, or as a mixture of both of them? And for that, we need to have some idea. And let me also give you some examples so we know something. If you have seen solar concentrating applications, there's a tower, and I'm just drawing a particular thing, which is supported at a height over the ground. And there are lots of mirrors here called heliostats, which reflect solar energy onto this. So what has happened is, this solar radiation falls on this. Part of it is absorbed, some of it is reflected, and this surface, the external surface of this becomes hot. And because it is in contact with the surrounding air, it is going to lose energy from there. So we got solar energy, but we are going to lose some of it to the surrounding air. The rest of it, we can say at the back, I have coils which are water is flowing through it, and I'm generating from that. And that's how I generate electricity. So that's what we want to maximize, but we cannot avoid loss to the atmosphere. If the conditions are such that there is no wind, ambient is absolutely still, this becomes a convection problem, natural convection problem, or you can call it as a free convection problem. No wind, free convection. The other extreme, a very strong wind blowing over it. And then you can say, okay, if it is 30 kilometers per hour or 60 kilometers per hour wind, then what happens? Then we can calculate all these numbers, and maybe you could come to the conclusion that if you have, say, a strong wind, this would be force convection. And you say, okay, what is the relative orientation of the cylinder and the wind? You can say if the wind is running parallel to the ground, then this is a configuration of force convection from a cylinder in cross flow. And for that, we will pick up a correlation and estimate what is the heat transfer rate from this. But there are some cases, quite often, where you do not have very strong winds, and any time during the day, there will always be some light airflow over this, and that need not be like this also. It could maybe even be in some other direction. So you have a very gentle breeze or a transient wind, and this also happens. And in the atmosphere, it's not so that you'll always have this or always have this in a very constant way. The atmosphere is a hugely changing system, so the breeze changes with time and direction, and that is what you also have what is called a gust. That sometimes a little wind will come, then stop. Then again there will be some breeze, then less velocity, then more velocity. This happens in nature. In many of these cases, you would have a strong temperature dependent flow by buoyancy, at the same time a very weak flow induced by these gusts and the breeze that is coming in. In this case, both free convection and forced convection play their part, and we have what is called a problem of mixed convection. So the same application in the real world, sometimes some situations we go to analyze as a free convection problem, sometimes we analyze as a forced convection problem, and at other times we have to analyze as a mixed convection problem. It will also tell us a lot of things, including, say, local distribution of the heat transfer coefficient on this, which part of it will run very hot, where can I, the hot spots, where will it be? which means that is where the surface is becoming very hot because the heat transfer coefficient is low and you could expect damage at that point. So that is the reason why one would like to know about hotspots on this, for which you need to know local heat transfer coefficient. So that's the case of this is an example of mixed convection. And a similar thing you can see even in your house. Say these days you have flat screen panels or your television set. That thing, if you touch it, it's slightly warm. But is it being cooled by free convection, or is it there under a ceiling fan where it is being cooled by forced convection? That will depend on what the temperature it gets. The same thing is true with the, say, a battery bank. And then you got to understand, well, what is it that I should use to analyze this? A problem that is nowadays of quite a great deal of importance is you have a lot of electric cars being talked about, and also cars with fuel cells. Now, you're going to keep this battery or this fuel cell somewhere inside the car. It is going to generate heat, so it will produce a hotter environment around it. The vehicle is in motion, it produces some motion on it. How do we predict the temperature distribution in the battery or temperature distribution in the fuel cells? And this is a very, very important question, because the life of that battery or the fuel cell depends on the temperature on which it operates. So this is a very live problem in which a lot of research is being called for. Okay, so that's some examples of types of convection. And now let's try to put together some criteria by which say, okay, if I check thing, I can say this is convection. If I check that thing, I say it should be forced convection. And the parameter that we will check is what we have just put up together, the Grashof number based on the length parameter divided by Reynolds number. I have put the same length parameter here, but in a minute let's take an example and we'll see whether the same length parameter actually makes sense or not. If this is very much less than 1, or say less than 0.1, this is one extreme. If the two are comparable, this will be of the order of 1, 0.8, 0.9, 1.1, 1.2, 1.5, even maybe 2 also. And what is the case where this ratio is very much greater than 1, maybe 100, maybe 1000, maybe 10,000, something like that. So let's see what happens. If this was the case, that this is very big, say 1000 types of thing or so, it means that this is very big compared to this. The inertia forces are not coming into a bit over here. Grashof number, this numerator is dominating, which means Grashof number is the important thing to take care of. This becomes a case of natural. The other extreme, where this is very much less than 1, maybe less than 0.1, maybe 0.001 or things like that. That means this denominator is very big compared to this numerator. That means the Reynolds number dominates. The buoyancy is not playing so much of a part, or the temperature-driven body force is not that important. Then we have only this thing to worry about. That gives us that this is a problem of force convection. And if the two are comparable, that means the buoyancy induced flow of velocity is order of same magnitude as the velocity by external forces, then both are important. We cannot take this problem as either this or as this and say, look, this has to be treated as a mixed convection problem. In every problem that comes to us, we would not like to make this type of a comparison, but it would be good if you do 1 or 2 problems and convince yourself that yes, for 10 meters per second airflow over a flat plate has to be treated as a forced convection problem. If you solve that problem and make this ratio, evaluate this ratio, you would see that that's going to be very much less than 1. But as the problem I have mentioned, there will be an issue if both are of comparable magnitude. And let's take one more example where that length parameter need not be the same parameter. Okay, and I'm going to give the example of a building. Okay, this is a building. and we said, I want to make an energy efficient building. Okay, so these days there is a mandatory requirement that when you design a building, you can have a green rating of the building. And one of the parameters in green rating is how much electricity it consumes. And one of the big things that electricity is consumed for is air conditioning. And then there is lighting. Air conditioning is usually dependent on how much energy heat goes into the building, which you have to then pump out because of the refrigeration work has to be done. So if you have to say that, well, what is the heat transfer from this wall, that will tell me how much energy is going into the building. Then if there is no wind, then this will have an air current which will come up like this and go up like that. Or maybe it's not even going to be like that. The ground is there, so the air will come here, but velocity is very small. It will go up, it will keep getting accelerated, then it will bend up over this flat plate and then go up. So streamlines like this, which are induced by buoyancy. The correct length parameter for evaluating the Grashof number in this problem is this length. And now you say, there is a small breeze also coming onto this building, and let's, for argument's sake, that the breeze came for this direction, but then what is going to happen is that the air is going to bend, and then it is going to come back, and then it's again going to bend. And say this velocity is there, and then the length parameter on which the Reynolds number will have to be calculated is this length of the building, we will call it W. So these are the two different length parameters that came in that particular calculation. And not just that, what else do we see by looking at this picture is that in the real world, if I want to analyze this building as a vertical flat plate for free convection, I am ignoring the effect of the ground because the air is going to come like this. I am ignoring the effect of the top where the air is going to go bend up and go like that. So these are two assumptions that I have done. The answer I will get from this simple analysis is going to be somewhat different from the real answer that I have. And if I have to get the real answer, I have to actually solve the flow around the three-dimensional building by the technique that I just explained, which is CFD. The second thing that will happen is, even on the force convection analysis of this problem, we say that I will take this wall as a flat plate with a flow parallel to this plate. Well, in reality, that is not happening because this flow is coming in and bending around this thing, coming here and then again bending around over there. So it's not strictly exactly a flat plate, but then assuming it to be a flat plate and letting the boundary layer grow from here is the simplest assumption we can make, and you get some order of magnitude of this answer. So those are the type of geometrical approximations that we do. And from that approximation, we are then using some heat transfer configuration. And this is important to define because this configuration told us which correlation to use. And then we must remember that the answer that we get is not something which is accurate within plus minus 1% or plus minus 2%. The correlation itself was accurate to say at least plus minus 5%, if not plus minus 20%. And the geometry modification that we did, this introduced its own differences. So the final answer compared to what the real thing will do may be of plus minus 20%, maybe in some cases plus minus 30-40%. But at least what this analysis gave us is a very quick way of an order of magnitude analysis of what actually happens. So it is good. And one must always do this first before saying that, okay, now let me go to a computer and do a full numerical simulation of this and then get the answer from there. So that's an example of the length parameter that came into this particular calculation of where Grashof number and Reynolds number come into play. So that's the idea for that. So what we have learned now is we now have a complete picture that given a heat transfer problem, how can I decide whether it is free convection, forced convection or mixed convection? If it is forced convection, then what geometry do I take? And based on that, what correlation do I take? If it is natural convection, what geometry I take here, and then how do I go forward from there? So we have reached that point. What we still need to do is, what are the other configurations in natural flow, because we have only looked at one case. A plate, vertical plate in still heated or cooled, both cases the solution is going to be the same. Let's look at a little bit on the dynamics of the boundary layer that is developed on the plate, and then we will go to other configurations. We have for us something that we learned earlier, that if this is a flat plate on which there was airflow coming in, and we neglected things normal to this plate, we said that a laminar boundary layer develops, it becomes into a transition mode, and then a turbulent boundary layer develops. So we have correlations that tells us, well, what is Hx at the point here, what is Hx here, and then by averaging the whole length, integrating it, then you can get average Nusselt number for the length of the plate. What happens in this case is that you have a vertical plate, different temperature, the boundary layer grows, yes, at some point it transits, and then it becomes a turbulent boundary layer. So here you will get turbulent boundary layer, here it could be a laminar boundary layer. And this approximate point where the transition takes place is Grashof number 10 to the power 9. So in the problem, if Grashof number is less than 10 to the power 9, what we conclude is that the natural convection boundary layer that builds up on this plate, or in the opposite part where the plate is cold and the boundary layer builds like that, this is a laminar boundary layer, and you have to then pick up that particular correlation for this. If the Grashof number is more than 10 to the power 9, it means that the plate has a laminar boundary layer for some part followed by turbulent boundary layer. Even in this case, it may be laminar up to here and then turbulent up to there. Then for this entire length of the plate, we can then pick up a correlation and say what is the average Nusselt number for this entire plate, which is a combination of both of them, and use that to get the average heat transfer coefficient. Okay. So what the average Nusselt number does, it gives us the average heat transfer coefficient for the whole plate, 0 to L. So that's what we want for total heat transfer from the plate. It camouflages what happens at the local points. The thickness of the boundary layer growing like this means that in this particular case, the coolest point on the plate will be at the bottom. As you keep going, the plate temperature will keep on increasing. In this case, it will be opposite. So that is the criteria. 10 to the power 9 Grashof number is sort of a threshold below which we have a laminar flow. Greater than that, we have a laminar plus turbulent flow. Okay, now we look at various other modifications of the vertical plate by first looking at the inclined plate, then we'll look at the horizontal plate, then we'll look at cylinder. So inclined plate represents two types of issues. That the plate is like normal to the paper, that's what I have drawn. So this is the plate. Okay, so that's the plate, and the back part of the plate is insulated and the heat transfer surface is looking downwards. In this case, this is the plate which we said this is insulated and the heat transfer surface is on the upper side. We look at two cases, and we'll also look at the qualitative way what happens. We'll say, well, what happens when the plate is heated? The ambient fluid is at T infinity. If the plate is heated, we say TW is greater than T infinity in this case as well as in this case. And let's see what it does. When this is the case, the hot surface is below, the air will rise because of buoyancy, and this flow will get established like this. So this will have air coming in there and going off there. So you have air being coming in there. So the buoyancy force is acting in the same direction as the fluid is moving. So that is a nice thing to have here. What happens in this case is this plate has become hot. This fluid wants to rise, this fluid wants to rise, this fluid wants to rise, this fluid wants to rise. They are not going to wait for everything to flow like this and then rise up. So we end up seeing that part of the fluid will rise from here, part of the fluid will rise from here, and part of the fluid will rise from here, and it gives rise to a very inexact way of where the airflow takes place, and this one we call as thermals. We see this as an extreme case on the Earth, where the Earth surface is, say, largely flat. When all the air gets heated up, it has to rise because of buoyancy, but then it cannot just rise everything up because the continuity equation cannot be satisfied. This particular model, the continuity equation gets satisfied because the hot air is rising there, the cold air is going in there. So the atmosphere sets up these types of flow patterns. The same thing is happening with an inclined plate. So we have correlations for this. They are much more well behaved. These correlations are somewhat very difficult to come up with. The second case is a cooled plate. So if this plate facing down were cooled, then what will happen is what is happening in this case. That here you have the plate over there, back part is insulated, this fluid is getting cold, this is getting cold, and because of the density gradient that has developed, this fluid would like to come down. Gravity is acting downwards in all these cases. So it will do something like that. This fluid will start going down there, this fluid will start going down there, and then this fluid will all go down over there. In between you have some fluid rising, and this will become an unstable situation. If this were to be cooled, in this case, you would have this situation there. So you have this plate over there. This is colder than the air. So all of this will come down, it will form a nice boundary layer, and will start going down. So at least these two cases, we can approximate that it's a slight deviation from the vertical plate. And the deviation is taken care of by the fact that the force that is going along the plate, if this is theta, this is g cos theta. So as a first approximation, we can use the vertical plate correlation, replace g by g cos theta, and get the same solution. Obviously that this approximation is good if theta is not too large. So if the plate is vertical and it is inclined by only say 10 degrees, g cos 10 gives a reasonably good estimate of heat transfer from the plate. This answer is okay as long as theta is less than 60 degrees. After 60 degrees, this approximation is quite bad, and correlations, if you make an experimental measurement and try to get this number from a correlation by this way, there will be a very big difference. It is not recommended in that case. There are separate set of correlations for these two cases, which do not follow this nice g cos theta analogy, but they would be reasonably okay to at least get a first number. So this is how you tackle inclined plate where inclination is limited to 60 degrees. Where would we find such surfaces? Well, this is what you would see when your house with a roof which is like that. And these type of things you would see inside also buildings, or maybe even in some, say the hood of an automobile, where the hood is at an angle and it is getting heated, and what type of flow do you see in the engine compartment? That's what would happen. So that was a inclined plate. Then we come to the extreme case where theta now becomes 90 degrees and just independently classify this as a horizontal plate. So how do I get heat transfer coefficient on a horizontal plate? So you have two conditions which you call stable, two are unstable. The stable condition is that you have a plate with the heat transfer surface downward and TW greater than T infinity. So what this does is, this will induce a flow which is coming like this flow will come like that, this flow will come like that, this flow will come like that, it will bend over, and then depending on what is there on top, flow will go off like that. So that's the streamlines that are put up there, and what will happen is you have hotter fluid over there, even colder fluid there, very cold fluid over there, and finally T infinity there. So you have isothermals developing parallel to the plate. That's the fluid flow direction, and then you can see what it is. So these velocities are relatively small, then it depends on what sort of temperatures we are looking at. So this is a stable flow condition. It will remain like that for all times. The counterpart which becomes a stable flow is that this is a surface where the heat transfer surface is upwards and TW is less than T infinity. So the whole problem is flipped up. That the heat transfer surface is on the top and its temperature is less than the surrounding fluid temperature. In this case, the opposite of this will happen. That this fluid will come there and go off there. This is the way the flow will take place. This will go off there, this will go off there, and then this will go off there. And so you'll have, this is the coldest wall. The fluid temperature here will be slightly less colder, and finally it will be the ambient surrounding temperature. So that's the way the isotherms will get formed. So this is also a stable case, and for both these cases we have reasonably nice correlations of this as a function of Grashof number. Length is this parameter into Prandtl number, some function of this. But it could so happen in real problems that normal to the surface, nothing is infinite. So you could actually have that this plate is, if it is square, then at least you know that both sizes are same. If this thing is circular, you know that the diameter is there. So well, what will you do if the plate is a rectangular? One side is much bigger than the other side. So then you have to worry about, I use this parameter or I use this parameter. If this one is much longer, then only this one will dominate the heat transfer coefficient, otherwise the other one will come into play. So all of that what we do would mean that we are working with an approximation. So that was the stable part of the problem. Now let's see what is the unstable part. So here it is that the plate, the heated surface is facing upwards. Okay, so here there is TW greater than T infinity and it is facing up. This is the situation you see in many cases. So for example, if you have an electronic box or something, the top is getting heated up, how does it exchange heat with the air? So that would be the case. So many electronic things which are sitting in still air, the box itself is dissipating heat. The roof of a house, this would be like that. Or say a large plate which has been manufactured and kept there, it is cooling in still air. So there are all cases where the hot surface is facing upward. Or when you are lying down, that in a cooler air, that's also the same case. The hotter surface is bottom and you are facing upward. Or the earth. So what is happening in this case is what happened in the other case what I had shown, that there is no stable predictable pattern that comes up. Yes, with a lot of powerful computer simulations we can even capture that, but qualitatively what this is showing us is that some air will rise here, some air will rise there, and some air will rise over there. So it is not that all the air came from below and went up. There is hot fluid going up over there, and to maintain continuity at any slice over there, cold fluid is going down there. So this sets up a whole variety of types of circulation patterns, and it's not so easy to predict these things. The counterpart of this is when the plate is such that the cold surface is facing downwards. So you have, this is the plate, and you have now, this is the surface which is cooled, TW less than T infinity. The fluid here again would become cold and would like to fall down, but it's not going to happen because continuity is forcing that that's not going to happen. So you will end up having something like this, that you have regions where streams of cold fluid are coming down and streams of warmer fluid are going towards the plate. So you have cold fluid going there and in between warm fluid coming up over there. So although they are both quite common, it's not so easy to estimate this, and you do have correlations, but then the flow is very unstable, the flow is not exactly predictable, so your correlations, whatever one may use, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. Plus minus 20% is not uncommon. Okay, so what it also means is that you have to take that, okay, it says heat transfer is going to be 20 kilowatts, I should be prepared to accept anything between say 18 and 22 kilowatts, like that. And clearly, reporting an answer to 5 places of significant places doesn't make sense in this type of uncertainty. Okay, so we leave this part now and look at other surfaces of convection. The next thing I put up here is a cylinder in cross flow. The example I gave of, say, a hot wire or an electric power cable with generating heat, that could be approximated as a cylinder in cross flow. So what happens in this case is we say that the length is much greater than the diameter, and we say that this is where the cylinder sits. And let's take the case TW is very much greater than T infinity. So what is going to happen is that because this air, because the fluid around this is going to get hot and you have gravity acting there, it will establish a flow so that fluid comes here like this and then it will rise. And also it will also take in more fluids from here and make it rise. That's the type of flow patterns we expect to see. Let's ask the question, what will be the temperature distribution in this fluid? Okay, and I'll show you a picture on that. Okay, so here is a picture. This is again an interferogram, Mach-Zehnder interferometer. The cylinder is horizontal, normal to the screen, and the dark and bright lines reflected lines of constant temperature, because these are also lines of constant density. And what one sees is that here you have on the bottom portion, if you see this, there are parallel lines, and okay, the cylinder is at constant temperature, and let me see, there's constant temperature, constant heat. Yeah, the constant temperature. So you can see lines that are getting spaced further and further apart, which means that the same temperature difference is happening over longer distances. That's what it tells us about temperature difference away from the surface. Right at the bottom, you will have some sort of a stagnation point and then air going this way. But then if you see the temperature lines, they go off here and up to about this point, this thermal boundary layer thickness, which is this much, this outer line to the surface, here it is this line to this point. This is not changing too much, but it also tells us that compared to the diameter of the cylinder, how thick is the thermal boundary layer. That's what we are able to see in this picture. And then in the upper part of the cylinder, something very different is happening. That instead of closing up, this isotherm is going up there, the next one comes there, and then one isotherm comes there and drops off there, this comes here, this goes there, this temperature line comes there and stops. So let's ask the question, what is the thickness across which the cylinder temperature and T infinity are being felt? So here you have the surface temperature here and T infinity happening over here. So that is the thickness over which that temperature gradient is there. If you look at the same thing at the bottom, almost the same magnitude but slightly less than this point. Here it is probably the thinnest, here it has become slightly thicker. It is now thicker here. And then if you say, well, what is happening on the top? Well, the top is not seeing T infinity probably at all. So very long distance above the top point of the cylinder, that the fluid gets to T infinity. That means from here the distance to the ambient temperature was this much, which was more than what was there at say 90 degrees. At this point it has become this much bigger, and at some point it is even bigger than the diameter of the cylinder. So this thing is telling us a lot of things about what is happening to heat transfer from the cylinder. That the local heat transfer coefficient will be highest somewhere in this range, about 90 degrees or thereabout. It is slightly less by maybe about 20%, 30% at the bottom point, and it will be very poor on the top point, considerably poor. So there's a big variation of the local heat transfer coefficient along the direction, starting say from the bottom. If you have theta equal to 0, if you go up to theta equal to 180 degrees, we are seeing a low heat transfer coefficient, increases, then again decreases. Okay, so that is what this picture is telling us, and you can actually get quantitative data from this, because each line you know how much temperature difference you are seeing, and everything else can come out from there. So this gives us a wealth of information about what happens in a cylinder. One thing is very clear, that because the heat transfer coefficient at the top is very poor, the bottom is much better, then this part will dissipate less heat than this part. So consequently, if you are cooling a big solid object in still air, the bottom part will cool much faster than the top part. The sides will also cool. So you have three sides here where the temperature in the lower half of the cylinder is much lower than the upper half. And if it is just being cooled, like I explained for a steam turbine rotor, the upper part will become colder. It will start contracting because of thermal expansion related effects. And finally, the cylinder which was straight will no longer remain straight. It becomes bowed, and you have a very, very big problem because of that. Okay, so this is what this picture was saying, that the heat transfer coefficient is minimum somewhere over here, maximum here, and minimum at these 2 points. And we just make a qualitative plot on what we have just argued out. If this is theta 0 degrees, 90 degrees, and 180 degrees, we would say here is some heat transfer coefficient. It becomes more here and then drastically drops over there. It is not 0, and this is, we'll call it h theta, as the local heat transfer coefficient along different locations of the cylinder. Having done that, or done an experiment and measured the total heat transfer from the cylinder, we can then define the local average heat transfer coefficient for this whole thing based on diameter d. And so we have a Nusselt number based on d for get the average heat transfer coefficient, and this is again a function of Reynolds number based on diameter and the Prandtl number. That's the type of correlation we get. So what we need is diameter, the temperature of this, and temperature far away from this. There's one case where TW is constant, which is the T case, the isothermal wall. For that, there's a set of correlations. A second case is when you have electrically heated thing, which is what you have in the electric cable, H. Here you will get another type of correlation. But in this H case, it tells you that if this is the local heat transfer coefficient variation on this, the local surface temperature variation is going to be exactly the opposite. That here the temperature will be high, here the temperatures will be low, and at the top temperatures will be much higher. You then have to really worry what happens to this thing. So this is the temperature thing, this is the local heat transfer coefficient. So that is the case of a horizontal cylinder, and we can get data from that. A sister thing related to that is a sphere. So you just have a circular object sitting in still air at T infinity. Something very similar to the cylinder happens. Relations are also somewhat similar, and you get a Nusselt number based on diameter for the average heat transfer coefficient, which is related to the Reynolds number and the Prandtl number. An ideal sphere, we will get some cases where you do have that sphere, but there are other situations where it may not exactly be this thing. For example, if you want to calculate that what is the heat transfer from the head of a person, and we remember that heat transfer from the head is very, very critical for maintaining the healthy condition, whether it is a heat wave or whether it is extreme cold. The head loses a large part of the disproportionately large part of heat compared to the rest of the body. So even though this is a very complex shape with an ear sticking out there and a nose and a lip and everything else, as a first approximation, we can take this to be a sphere and get some idea of what happens there. So in general, if you have some sort of an irregular object, a quick order of magnitude analysis, assuming a sphere, is okay. Okay, so that is for sphere. And now we come to a slightly different type of heat transfer problem of it's not free convection. Now we are strictly looking at natural convection. Which means that you no longer have an infinite fluid around the surface. The fluid is now completely enclosed between some surfaces, and the simplest case is two large parallel plates which are facing each other, and that's what I have drawn here, that this is one plate and this is the second plate. So if you look at the edge view, the simplest thing to make is that I have one plate there and one plate over there. And one can say that the upper part is adiabatic and insulated. This part is also adiabatic and insulated. Where do we get a practical example of this? Well, this is there in buildings. If you want to maintain cold temperature, you just give a small gap between two parts of, say, a wall, the inside wall and an outer wall with a small air gap in it, and this gives a very good thermal insulation because in between now you have air. So this is a solid there, this is a solid, you have a small air gap in between. The thermal conductivity of air is very, very poor. So if you have only air in natural convection, it's an extremely good insulator. But when you have a slightly larger space and natural convection sets in, then the overall conductivity of that air layer is much better than when it was still. Then it doesn't do such a great job of being an insulating layer. So this is something you have to worry about. A similar thing is done in many cold conditions where you have what you call double glazed windows. So the window allows light to come in, but this is on one side you have one glass, so this is a glass. The other side you have another glass. In between there is a thin layer of air, and when it is outside temperature is -10, -20 degrees Celsius, and inside you want to have 20, this provides excellent insulation. The same thing can be done with walls also. So you give air gap between brick layers, walls, you get very good thermal insulation, not good just for cold climates, but also equally justifiable for hot climates. And if you see traditional architectures in very hot climates, they have exploited this idea again and again to make much more comfortable conditions inside than when it is very hot outside. And coming back to this, the problem that we are looking at is that this is a wall at a higher temperature, Tw, and the other wall is at a lower temperature, say Th, and this is Tc, or you can call it T1 and T2, doesn't matter. T1 greater than T2. And the important parameter here we are assuming is that the spacing we may call it L, say, is much greater, L is much less than the sides of these plates. So this dimension, the dimension of the plate normal to this, is 10 times, 100 times, 1000 times greater than L. And the way we will now want to ask what is the heat transfer rate between this and this. So that we will say that this is Q dot, this is equal to, say, double prime, because it's a very large plate. Q dot double prime heat transfer rate per unit area is some sort of an average heat transfer coefficient into Th minus Tc. This is what we want. There is no T infinity in this problem, so there is no infinite fluid here. What does this average heat transfer coefficient depend on? And this depends on the fluid mechanics of what's going on over here, and that is a function of N. And many things happen in this case. We can start with a case where this L is extremely small, and we can then define what is the range on which it happens. If it is very small, the temperature difference here is causing this fluid to go up and set up a current like this. But because it is so small, viscous forces are very high, and so it prevents the fluid from any motion at all. So that's where you end up getting a still fluid or a near still fluid, and then H. It becomes a very simple case that in this case what will happen is nothing else is happening, only conduction is taking place, and if you look at what is the correlation there, then Nusselt number is 1. Which means that HL upon K is equal to 1 and H bar is equal to K upon L. And K upon L, you will realize in some way is the conduction resistance that you have learned. And you can now see that this thing is also telling you the idea of the convective resistance. And if Nusselt number is 1, it means that there is no convection induced augmentation of conduction. It is exactly equal to conduction. That is the one extreme case. Now when you start imposing different temperatures, start making this big for the same temperature difference, various things begin to happen, and you get 3 or 4 different regimes of flow. The first will be that, yes, there will be a temperature gradient, but there will be no constant temperature here. So here you'll have temperature happening there, and then it goes over there. And the fluid flow is such that this velocity fluid will rise here, center velocity won't be 0, and then it will turn around. Sorry, there will be a 0 here, yeah. But it is a point 0. So velocity profile becomes like this. Boundary layer at the wall and some gradient at the center. This is one category. The second category will be that it's no longer 0 over here, but it is big enough that you have slightly some portion where the velocity becomes 0. So you have velocity becoming like this, it becomes like that, and then it becomes like that. What this tells us is that in between you have a region where there is no airflow, and in both cases what you have happened is warm fluid has gone up there, come down from there, and completed the circulation over there, so that conservation of mass is maintained, continuity is maintained. So this wall ends up setting up these types of circulation currents, and they will then increase Nusselt number. So in each of these regimes, you have different equations for average Nusselt number based on the spacing as a function of the Grashof numbers based on spacing and the Prandtl number of the fluid. So you have to then see that this is the case, what the Grashof number, what the Prandtl number, pick up the right correlation. But in reality, what is happening is that this is what the fluids are doing. Okay, so that tells us what happens in natural convection in enclosures. Okay, we have a few more minutes, so if there are questions, we will take that. But I'll also touch upon one more thing, which is related to the vertical surfaces. We looked at the case of a horizontal cylinder. Now let's look at the case of a vertical cylinder. So this was like that, and we said that airflow takes place around this and something happens. Well, now we make the same cylinder and make it vertically standing. And suppose this was a solid cylinder and the temperature was at some value, then what will happen is that air will begin to go up along the walls, and then of course depending on what the top is, it will start going off in certain way. That's what the type of air current we get. And in case L by D is very large, greater than a certain number, then we can assume that the flow that is happening here, a small portion of this cylinder, this much say, can be approximated as a vertical wall, a vertical plate, and exactly the same correlations can be used over here. So some conditions, we can model this whole thing as a vertical plate whose length is the length L and whose width is pi d. So you can open up the cylinder, treat it as a vertical flat plate and use the flat plate correlations to get it. If this is not exactly very large but moderate, then there is correlations which tell you this is a correction factor which is decent enough for this. So that's how you can tackle what happens on a cylinder where flow is taking place on the outside. Now so where do we encounter this? Say a tall metallic thing like a chimney. If you see a foundry or somebody who has a furnace, they have a pipe sticking out of the top and you want to know what is the cooling taking place on the outside. If it's only natural convection, then this is what's going to be a decent model. We'll end by looking at a case where we are worried about natural convection inside the cylinder. So the outer surface is heated up and we ask what happens to the inside surface. How can I learn about that? Well, what we know that you would expect boundary layers to start building up and maybe at some point they start beginning to merge. So this becomes a problem in its own right. Okay, so now what we do is, what's the easiest way to look at it? We say, well, can I model it in the same way that I model the outside part? The answer is, well, you can't really do it exactly like that. But if again, if L is very much greater than D, or in this case, if the thickness of the boundary layer, say the hydrodynamic or the thermal boundary layer, doesn't matter, is very much less than the diameter at the top. At this point, the boundary layer is this thin, this boundary layer is that thin. Then we can say that as a first approximation, I am justified in making this into a opening it up and treating it as this problem. We will of course be ignoring the fact that the central velocity keeps on picking up because of continuity being forced on. Okay, so we have covered natural convection and free convection. We have seen what are the governing equations, and the important thing was that the temperature came as an explicit item in the x momentum equation. We then non-dimensionalized it and defined what is a Grashof number, what it means, and then we looked at various cases of flat plates and spheres and cylinders to see what is the nature of the flow and what type of a correlation we expect. So all these correlations are listed in a sheet that I will pass out, or if you have books, those things will be there. But the important thing is to remember that you got to be clear what geometry you are dealing with and what is the correlation for, and whether it's the same Reynolds number, Grashof number, Prandtl number. So finally, we also learned how to take a heat transfer problem and say whether it is forced convection or whether it is free convection, or a third case we learned something called mixed convection. Okay, so with that we will stop here.